So about 2 years ago, I came across the first YouTube channel, or at least the first YouTube Ideas channel, that I would really consciously subscribe to. And before then, I think I was just listening to political podcasts here and there, maybe something else, but the world had really changed. The left was going insane. This was around the time that Brendan Eich had been fired just for opposing gay marriage. And I had just returned to a college campus to get a graduate degree. Things that I never thought would be seriously under discussion in the mainstream were becoming a reality. And the tenor of crazy progressivism that I thought would eventually be tempered down had instead just exploded. And it seemed that the mainstream politics, the mainstream political podcasts, the mainstream approach to conservatism just wasn't addressing the reality I was seeing, at least not the reality of being in a major progressive city in 2013. And I think this is really the niche that was filled by Sargon of Akkad. Strangely enough, this was the voice that had come out of the New Atheist movement, a movement that I had in many ways dismissed up until this point as being not particularly thoughtful and not particularly willing to point out obvious flaws of the left. But in this case, Sargon absolutely was able to do this, and do this in a very thoughtful manner, and he seemed to actually confront the insanity I was seeing more or less on a daily basis in my newsfeed and on the campus that I attended. And so Sargon quickly became one of my favorite channels. He combined a certain amount of rationalism and a certain historical perspective that I found refreshing, and as the progressive insanity ramped up and we saw things like Gamergate and other major progressive failings, and as it eventually led into the disasters that were the clone cover-ups in early 2016, I began to see Sargon as something more than just a YouTuber. I saw him as perhaps a figure that might move a new type of conversation forward in the media. And this was needed because the mainstream media was such a manifest failure in how it covered the primary elections and how it covered the clone and the other terrorist assaults that were going on at this time. And it was not inconceivable that perhaps YouTube might be the place to grow a movement to try to push through and push a counter-narrative against the mainstream progressive narratives that were going on worldwide. So what happened? Well, in short, I do still think that YouTube is a place that movements can grow out of, but I don't think that Sargon and the cultural libertarians are the people that are even capable of bringing us to any kind of force that can seriously pose a sustainable counter-narrative to the forces that currently run the media. At the end of the day, Sargon isn't ready to fight a culture war. And I think this surprises a lot of people because as good as Sargon is at making fun of the weird feminist SJWs that we see on YouTube, as good as he is at pointing out the flaws and logical inconsistencies in these positions, he's going to lose against them. The SJWs will defeat Sargon and the cultural libertarians eventually. Now, once again, as I was making this video, I realized that I really couldn't tell the story of Sargon and the cultural libertarians without first telling the story of the political and cultural environment of the last 10 years. Strangely enough, this sort of segues very well with the previous story I told about the emergence of New Atheism, because it begins right at the height both of the Progressive Coalition and the New Atheist movement, which I think is indisputably the first Obama administration, 2008 to 2012. Now, as I mentioned in my other video, and we'll summarize here again, the era was really characterized by a consensus or an impression that the solution to almost all social problems really lay in the adoption of mixed economy welfare statism and hard secularism. Now, of course, this was mainly a reaction to specific problems that emerged out of the Bush administration and the 90s, but for a brief time period starting in around 2007, it seemed that potentially this was the solution, and all the myriad problems that had plagued welfare statism and secularism in the past really weren't going to be a problem, and really all that was required was to reject religiosity, embrace sort of the pseudo-scientific notion that the state could be scientifically managed, and all of the big problems would take care of themselves. And of course, this error has two main consequences, or two main outlets that we see this attitude expressed through. The first, on the macrocosmic level, is the emergence of the Obama coalition, the standard liberal progressive approach to politics, where everything was seen through the lens of economics and scientific management, and really the more conservative principles were dismissed. On the micro level, on the internet side, on the cultural side, we see the emergence of things like the New Atheist movement. This is, of course, the emergence of the atheism as an identity, the atheism where they hold huge conventions, and this is sort of the high period of the New Atheism in my understanding. And again, both of these things are really characterized by an understanding that really all that was needed was to reject the failures of religion, the failures of conservative moral philosophy, and really all that was needed was sort of a negative reaction. So in the end, reality reasserted itself. It turned out that these movements, like the Liberal Progressive Political Alliance and the Atheism as Identity movements, the New Atheist movements, were really predicated on not answering a series of questions that really did need to be answered. As long as these questions were kept vague enough, the coalition would hold together, but as soon as people really asked themselves what they wanted to see in the world, what they wanted to accomplish, the coalitions would immediately shatter, and it would be apparent that people were not actually in favor of the same things. You can see this on the macro level in the division between Bernie Sanders supporters and Hillary Clinton supporters, where you see that the Obama coalition really was two in part, and the corporate socialist, identitarian people really didn't have a lot to do with the New Deal-ish socialist, non-identitarian coalition members. And as soon as Obama himself stepped away from the scene, this division became absolutely apparent. But I think for this talk, the real focus should be on the New Atheist community, the rationalist and liberal progressive alliance as it existed in the cultural space. And again, here, the coalition on the cultural side was really two different groups, not one group. There were the more moderate liberals who preferred some amount of state intervention and who distrusted religion. Then there were the neo-Marxist identitarians, people who had serious problems with almost every cultural element of Western society and sought to really subvert that and remake it in a new, more equalist image. These are the people that we sometimes refer to as social justice warriors, or SJWs for short. And this was a problem with the coalition from the very beginning, but because of the particular situations that pertained in the early 2000s, no one really realized that there were these problems. And I remember myself thinking in 2007 that this new sort of stuff that I was seeing coming out of Christopher Hitchens and perhaps even Obama, this was the way to bring humanity forward. But it really was a total illusion. And you see the cracks forming in this coalition really after 2012. At this point, it becomes apparent that gay marriage, which up until this point was, I think, the main sort of cultural glue that kept these two groups together, after 2012 it becomes apparent that gay marriage is accomplished. It has not yet been made national law, but it's more or less a matter of time. In 2012, the coalition had won actual electoral victories, and almost all of the major power centers were in their favor, and this was essentially going to happen. Now, I'll do a separate video on gay marriage itself, but I think that, suffice to say, at the point of political victory, both of the groups that made up this coalition really understood that they had to go on talking about what their victory meant for the culture, and how this victory would be used to change culture, to bring it forward into the future. And this is where the real differences started emerging. Suffice to say that the moderate liberals saw gay marriage as more or less a corrective, as the modification of an institution to become slightly more accommodating and just fixing an odd inequality in our system. Whereas the more radical progressives, or as we might term them, the SJWs, they saw the advent of gay marriage as the first step in a larger campaign to really tear down most Western gender and sexuality norms, as a way of simply flipping the cultural pyramid on its head. And this manifested in a variety of conflicts, starting from standard free speech battles on college campuses and carrying over to things like the emergence of the Atheism Plus movement, and finally the emergence of the large cultural conflict Gamergate. In each of these instances, the general framework was was the same. An institution that had previously been more or less considered a tool of the secular progressive coalition was then being taken over by people more on the radical progressive and identitarian side in an attempt to use that institution to promote more radical notions of gender, identity, and race. And of course, this was resisted by more liberal moderates who saw the job of the institution really not being to promote these radical concepts. And at the end, the two sides were at loggerheads. And this, I think, is best represented by Gamergate, which, although it has many origins and many caveats, really fundamentally was a cultural war between video games journalists, who were predominantly of the more radical identitarian progressive bent, and video games players, which were really of the more moderate liberal bent in their outlooks. And generally, I think the dynamic that played out in most of these battles was that despite the fact that the radical progressives and the identitarians, or the SJWs, did things that were outrageously crazy and sometimes even stupid, they somehow always seemed to keep the upper hand when it came to interactions with the rest of the world, when it came to interactions with the modern media. And as such, a lot of the more moderate liberal types were left almost homeless. They had to concede that they were in some sense losing this battle. And this is where people like Sargon of Akkad and Thunderfoot and the cultural libertarians really came into this battle and tried to set up a new front to push back on the more radical SJW progressivist narrative. Now, initially, I think quite rightly so, a lot of these people were seen as more or less just provocateurs, as people who were bellyaching about feminists wearing pink hair and complaining about the patriarchy and how they're being exploited and how they're being oppressed, even though they are obviously privileged themselves. But more fundamentally, I think this partially changed during Gamergate, when it seemed that perhaps people like Sargon and the other cultural libertarians, like Milo Yiannopoulos or Laura Southern, they might actually accomplish some kind of institutional change. They might be able to organize people and push back against the media institutions like Gawker that were driving this more progressivist, identitarian politics. And so suddenly it became not just a way of bellyaching, but potentially a way of confronting the problem. This might be a mechanism by which the more moderate liberal ideas could get prominence once more. And again, the more radical identitarian politics would be pushed down, and essentially the secularist coalition would be able to survive in this way. But I think this optimism actually came to an end, and has come to an end quite recently, in really early 2016. And this is not because Gamergate wasn't a success, or that Sargon of Akkad lost some kind of debate against the progressive SJW types. It was really a realization of how institutionally embedded the hard progressive notions were inside the press of both Europe and America. And again, I think this had many manifestations, going from the media uninterest in Hillary Clinton's numerous corruption scandals to problems with how they covered Black Lives Matter and other issues of race in this country. But I think most important probably was the Cologne rape scandals and the Rotterdam scandal that racked Europe in early 2016. And here it was apparent that the media and the police force played ball with an attempt to de-emphasize a massive amount of rapes that were going on in Germany after the migrant crisis in late 2015. And really at this point, a momentous realization had to occur, because this wasn't just a problem of progressivist and radical thought in a few fresh out of college, purple-haired SJW types. This wasn't just the problem of one or two unfair media outlets who were pushing strange narratives about game journalism. This was a fundamental failure in the institutional level of both the police and the mainstream media, and they are both working in concert with this aim. And so I think people like Sargon of Akkad and the other cultural libertarians were confronted with a battle that was much larger than they ever were prepared to fight. And because of that, they've been at a loss as to what to do. In some sense, I think it's odd, because liberals writ large, the sort of liberal-minded, welfare state but not too far people, have never really been on the outside of a major cultural battle. It's always been the radicals, but now for once the roles are reversed. But it's this fight that I think they are fundamentally incapable of winning. Sargon and the cultural libertarians really can't defeat the progressive SJWs in a prolonged culture war. I can break it down into 3 reasons. So the first and most perhaps practical, mundane problem with the cultural libertarian movement that Sargon really embodies is that it really has no institutional support, nor does it have a means of obtaining any further institutional support. And I think to some degree this is realized. As I said, in some sense this was always the game plan of people like Sargon of Akkad, that they were going to essentially expose the radical progressives and SJWs, and after the exposure occurred, the mainstream media and the mainstream thinkers and the rationalists and liberals that everyone in society obviously was deep down inside where they didn't know it, after they exposed them for being dishonest, then there would be a correction in the mainstream, and from that correction, lasting change would emerge. But at this stage, I think it's very clear that this will never happen. So far, Sargon of Akkad and the other people who really brought up the serious abuses, both in things like Black Lives Matter and to a lesser extent in Gamergate, these objections have more or less fallen on deaf ears when it comes to the mainstream media. And of course, there are some exceptions. There's always the Christina Hoff Sommers. There are always the Breitbarts that are willing to cover this and kind of give it a little bit of headway. But at the end of the day, these are a minority voice, and moreover, they're fundamentally a conservative one. And all right, people might ask, so, well, what's wrong with appealing to conservatives? What's wrong with going this alternative direction? Well, the first problem is that these small conservative institutions don't actually really communicate with a larger cultural body. They are a part of a minority of voice, a voice that's been a minority for the last 30 years, at least culturally, so they can't really influence things on a media level. But more fundamentally, even on a political level, the conservative coalition is completely smashed. There's no real rhyme or reason that's governing it right now, and so it's really unclear who's even controlling anything, or if there will even be a viable conservative party in this country. And lastly, I think another point that needs to be brought up is just how uncomfortable people like Sargon and the rest of the cultural libertarians would be with being even part of a larger conservative movement. These are people who mainly cut their political teeth on opposing things that were fundamentally conservative, on being pro-gay marriage, on being anti-religion. And it's really hard to see how they're going to be integrated into what is at its essence sort of a traditionalist movement, even if it is a traditionalist movement that is fundamentally liberal and libertarian. So we're left with a movement that is going to be fundamentally a political orphan, and it's fundamentally going to be culturally orphaned or culturally separated from most of the big institutions that could ever give it mainstream spread. And this makes it a really strange thing. It can't really get its message out, and it can't really attract a sustainable number of people, and this is going to drag on the movement and drag on people like Sargon of Akkad after a while. The sort of cultural libertarian perspective is fundamentally a moderate perspective, and moderate perspectives don't do well being outcasts because very few people have very firm beliefs and very strong beliefs that are moderate. Usually a moderate position is what you do when you come to talk to other people. But if you can't even talk to other people, if you can't even get your message out there to a large degree, there's really no point in trying to be reasonable or moderate, because at the end of the day, there's no traction to it. There's no point. If you're a rebel, if you're on the outside, you want to be extreme. You want to be tagging the anarchist A on the walls and raising your fist on there, and it's no fun being the moderate guy who's not getting a position. You look less like punk rock rebel and more like the wallflower who no one decided to invite to any of their parties. And because of this, the fact that they are political orphans is going to eventually cave in the movement. Alright, so I think the second big problem with Sargon and the cultural libertarians, another huge reason why they're going to eventually lose to the radicals, what they term as the regressives or the SJWs, is that they don't understand how political discourse and cultural discourse occurs at a very, very large level. They're fundamentally obsessed with discussion and argument and rationalism. And I've made another video about this, but I'm just going to reiterate some of the main points here. Arguments don't just occur in some sort of perfect abstract dialectic. They don't occur in some vacuum. They are part of a culture and a part of a general perception of how the world is and should be. And in short, you can't win an argument if your audience doesn't agree with your premises. And very many of the arguments that we have now, especially on a culture war level, they fundamentally have parties that have just different premises, and there almost is no reason to have a logical argument starting from that point. And moreover, I would go on to say that most of the times where there is a big shift in how people approach things, it oftentimes is a cultural shift that results in radically different premises being inserted, or existing premises being replaced by new premises. And this is in fact what has happened with many of the issues concerning Black Lives Matter and other identitarian radical moves that have occurred recently. People haven't realized this, but a lot of core liberal premises have been subverted or outright replaced in the overall media narrative. The more and more you really think about something like liberalism, you have to realize that it's fundamentally a derivative entity, and it relies on the contemporary culture fully embracing a few notions about personal responsibility, a few notions about the fact that we actually have to own the risk that pertains to making individual decisions. And as such, there can be individual liberty because people are responsible for themselves at the end of the day. If this assumption is undermined, if we decide collectively as a culture that merely the existence of inequality as an ultimate outcome indicates some necessary injustice, if we say that any kind of deviation from parity means necessarily there has to be a malfeasance, we will have destroyed liberalism at its most basic level, because we will have said at that point that individual choices and individual liberties matter significantly less than the achievement of parity and the achievement of total equality of outcomes at the end of the day. And in such an environment, really no liberal arguments will be able to survive. Now, we're in a weird place in our culture right now, and because of that, it's led to a certain number of strange situations when it comes to discussion and debate in the public sphere. And the strange situation is brought on by the fact that a lot of these liberal assumptions are in the process of dying. They're held up sort of symbolically in the public square, but almost none of the elites who participate in the media or who participate in the high educational or government institutions really believe them anymore. And as a result, they're slowly dying away, but in informal discussions, people have to pay lip service to them. And for this reason, Sargon's position can seem very, very strong, especially in individual discussion. If Sargon were to discuss with some kind of hard progressive identitarian, he would in many cases, and in almost all cases, win, because in those kinds of discussions, the SJW progressives would have to essentially concede some of the assumptions of liberalism. And Sargon, at the end of the day, is very philosophically consistent with that particular assumption. And therefore, he would be very likely to win, to demonstrate how the SJW progressives' conclusions do not extend from that principle. But the problem is that since our culture is in this form of flux, the SJWs and progressives will eventually start becoming more consistent, and not because their ideas are becoming more in line with liberalism, but because the mainstream culture will become less liberal, and the progressives will feel less need to even accept the premises that Sargon relies on to make his liberal case. Therefore, they won't even be hypocrites. They'll just deny the idea of individual rights and individual liberty and individual responsibility wholesale. And at that point, no further discussion can really occur. Sargon and the cultural libertarians will lose every single discussion from that point forward because the premises are aligned against them. And no amount of rhetorical skill or logic is really going to solve that, because that's not what the discussion is about. They've given up the culture, they've given up the premises on which the arguments are based on, and therefore nobody is going to find what they say compelling at that point. And at the point when this happens, the whole cultural libertarian movement will seem a lot less like people speaking truth to power, or even people with this really, really great logical argument, and it will seem more like an isolated cultural community or a minority religion where these cultural libertarians just have strange beliefs that nobody in the mainstream really holds anymore. And they're much more akin to conservative religious people, or even the Amish, perhaps. And I'm not so sure that a movement like this can sustain itself in any long-term capacity. So this being the reality, the SJWs and progressives really just have to wait. The culture is changing, the demographics of this country are changing very rapidly, and it's not inconceivable that in 10 years there just won't be a majority coalition that even believes in liberal premises anymore. And at that point, they can do whatever they want to. So there's no real need for any people who are broadly more progressive or radical in their persuasions to even engage with people like Sargon or any of the other cultural libertarians. Alright, so the last problem with the cultural libertarian movement, and I think this one gets to the core of my issue with Sargon of Akkad and Kraut and Tea and the other people who broadly fall under the cultural libertarian banner. And that is, they just don't understand fundamentally what liberalism is. They do not understand themselves, their own ideology at a very basic level. Okay, so what do I mean by this? Obviously, Sargon and Kraut and Tea, these are very smart people. They have some knowledge of history. What aren't they understanding? So in essence, they don't understand liberalism. In particular, they don't understand what liberalism is, and they don't understand how it developed. Both this core historical misunderstanding and also this sociological misunderstanding has led to an enormous number of mistakes and huge strategic flaws in how they're approaching problems of the modern age. And I think a lot of this comes from misconceptions spread by the New Atheist movement, and these were essentially misconceptions that were much older, but at the same time they got their main temporary cultural push from New Atheists like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, and at a very basic level they're flatly not true. So let's start with the historical misunderstandings. Now, I think this is a misconception. I heard it a lot from people like Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins, and I heard it again from people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali. And this is this weird fetishization of the Enlightenment, and this idea that some new principle had emerged from the Enlightenment called liberalism. That this new idea was somehow culturally universal. It was an idea that could be spread across the entire world, and then it would replace everything, that it could be adopted without reference to religion or culture or ethics or custom or principle, that just by coming in contact with concepts such as freedom, democracy, equality, rationality, people would immediately gravitate towards it. Now, I think in our current time period, it is apparent that this is not true, that people do not naturally become liberals, that certain cultures even seem to be specifically hostile to liberalism as a concept. And even in the Enlightenment, I think people knew this, what people are repeating when they put forward this idea that liberalism is some kind of universal principle. They're really repeating sort of the propaganda of the 18th century. People never believed this, but sometimes they proclaimed it as a way of advancing sort of a notion of universal human liberty. But it was never true. Even the concept that the Enlightenment discovered this new principle of liberty is not historically true at all. In fact, an idea of individual liberty and governmental restraint was something that had existed in the European civilization and the Christian civilization for 1,000 years. This was just a property that Western civilization tended to have people more focused on individuals, as opposed to, say, the Asian empires, and people from Machiavelli on to Marco Polo pointed this out. This was something that was understood to be a cultural feature. Now, after the Reformation occurred, it became increasingly important to take what had been sort of an implicit cultural element of the societies in general, that had been part of the religion that governed those societies, and because there was no longer religious uniformity, moved that guarantee from being cultural to being explicitly part of the nation state. The 17th and 18th century philosophers, what those people were doing were just explaining, creating an alternative theory of what had already been done largely in a lot of Western European countries. They were explaining the origins of rights. They were not proclaiming new concepts. And the proclamation of those concepts by the Enlightenment authors was not immediately an irresistible force. The only reason why they were so popular was because they had already been part of the culture of Western Europe for a very long time. And of course, this gets back to the previously mentioned concept of cultural premises. The Enlightenment ideas worked because there were core cultural premises there waiting for them to be used by Enlightenment authors. If those premises of individual responsibility and individual rights were not there, the Enlightenment principles of limited government, an autonomous individual, and a constrained state would have never taken off. In fact, insofar as many of these concepts became popular in countries like the modern Middle East and in Asiatic countries, it was because of the overwhelming military dominance of the West, and these liberal principles were seen as a key to achieving that military and economic and cultural dominance. Without the military and economic dominance of the West, very few of these countries would have actually adopted this liberalism to begin with. As we see contemporarily, many of these countries are discarding liberalism now that it is apparent that the West is in decline. And this historical misconception of liberalism has fed into what I call the sociological misconception of liberalism. The idea that liberalism is some inherent state of humanity, that if we take down all of the culture, all of the cultural institutions, what we'll be left with is some kind of hyper-liberalism. You can see this in things like anarchism and also libertarianism. The idea is that if we just destroy the state, then people will sort of progress back to this notion of individual liberty. And you see this oftentimes when libertarians talk about the formation of a state. And they'll say something like, the state was formed when people came together and decided that they needed a set of laws to secure people's liberties. Or you'll hear this in the Rousseauian notion that man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. And of course, both of these things are absolute hogwash. We know from historical records that society was not created when men came together to protect individual rights. We know that people came together for military power, and that individual rights and all those concepts are very, very new concepts. Moreover, this Rousseauian concept that man is somehow born free in a natural state, and it's only external pressures that make him authoritarian, is utterly ridiculous too. We know that people are by their nature authoritarians. They gravitate to authority figures. We see this everywhere across all human societies anthropologically. And I can't remember the author that said this, but his response to Rousseau was something along the lines of, sheep are born carnivores, but everywhere they eat grass. The notion is, well, if mankind's true nature is to be free, we would demonstrably see it anthropologically, and we don't. And so we have to understand that these things were fundamentally liberal propaganda and not actually statements of reality. This is something that I think early Enlightenment figures like the Founding Fathers understood. They understood that you needed a robust culture that supports individual responsibility in order to sustain a liberty. But later Enlightenment thinkers, particularly the late French Enlightenment thinkers, seem to forget this, and they seem to start believing their own bullshit, to use a crude term. But in modern day, a lot of the cultural libertarians have continued this pattern. They're still repeating the same Enlightenment BS, this idea that we just need to take down the anti-liberal forces. And this is why you get these ridiculous notions that all we need to do is get social justice out of schools. All we need to do is make sure that religion doesn't dominate our political environment. All we need to do is ensure that the SJWs don't control journalism. In some sense, this is a little bit true insofar as that these are malignant forces that inherently are anti-liberal, but it's incredibly insufficient. Just removing these forces will not do anything, because education, government, community building have to be built around individual ideas. And if there aren't ideas, if there aren't cultures there that put correct premises into play, these cultural vacuums will always be filled by something else. And that something else is more likely than not to be incredibly anti-liberal, because mankind's natural state is an authoritarian one, not a liberal one. And this has led to really the biggest mistakes of the cultural libertarian movement, being entirely negative, reactionary, and destructive in their attitude towards institutions. They see their opponents as if the only thing you need to do is destroy this round of cultural opponents. We just need to overcome Islamism this generation. We just need to make sure that there isn't Sharia law in this generation. We just need to make sure that cultural Marxism does not invade the schools this generation. And then everyone will see that liberalism is fine and they'll come to their senses. But there will always be forces in the world that want to have a constrained and obedient humanity. There always will be forces that want to destroy liberalism. And especially when it comes to Marxism and Islamism, which we know from experience are historically robust forces. They've been there in the case of Marxism for hundreds of years, but in the case of Islam for almost 2,000 years. And at this point, we know how they operate. They operate via persistence. And if they don't win this generation, they'll be back the next. And if all people have done right now is to beat them back for the time being, then the larger project of a liberated Western civilization is entirely doomed. Regardless of what you do contemporaneously to defeat these forces, in another 30 years, Islamists and Marxists will make another play to take over institutions broadly in the West. And if traditionalists and people who value Western values, including liberals, do not actually do something to counteract that attempt to put in long-lasting cultural institutions that focus on generating positive educational outcomes, they will be totally powerless to that future attempt. The only way to defeat these forces in the long term is a long, slow march through the institutions. And this is something that Sargon, Kraut, and the other cultural libertarians just seem constitutionally unwilling to consider. This is not a short-term project by any stretch of the imagination. So I guess this is sort of coming to the end of why I think Sargon and the cultural libertarians are eventually going to lose to the social justice warriors and perhaps even to the Islamists. Now, I hope Sargon fans who are watching this will approach me for more conversations, more dialogue on this, because this is one of the most important issues that we have going forward. How do we confront the manifest flaws of the radical left and the Islamists, both contemporaneously and in the future? And this is a large reason why I started this channel, because I saw just an utter lack of a kind of serious cultural conversation with how these forces will be contained and how positive cultural movements will be put into play so that in the long term, Western liberty and Western values can be preserved. So this video was really more of a beginning of a conversation than some kind of definitive conclusion. So I hope to see more of the cultural libertarian types in the comment section, and hopefully maybe even for hangouts in the future. I appreciate your feedback. Thanks for listening.